The sun-beaten ranch near the Mexican border holds more secrets than its weathered fences let on. To the ruthless outlaws who've just ridden in, John Harrison is nothing but a frail old rancher, watching helplessly as they take his beloved wife. Hostage, they mock his trembling hands and quiet demeanor, forcing him to surrender the deed to his land. What they don't know is that those hands once belonged to Black Jack Malone, the West's most feared gunslinger, who vanished without a trace 15 years ago. As they taunt his apparent weakness, a familiar glint returns to his eyes. Could the man they're threatening be the same legend who once made even the most hardened criminals pray for mercy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the desert sky in shades of amber and rose as John Harrison's boots crunched across the frost-covered ground. His weathered hands, marked by decades of both violence and honest work, wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as he made his morning rounds. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of hard-won Texas soil, every inch of it earned through 15 years of quiet determination. Inside the ranch house, Sarah hummed softly as she prepared breakfast, her silver-streaked hair caught in the early morning light. The scent of fresh biscuits and coffee drifted through the open window, a simple comfort that still amazed John after all these years. He paused at the barn door, watching as his wife moved about the kitchen with graceful efficiency. These peaceful moments were his redemption, bought with years of running from a past he'd buried deeper than any grave he'd ever dug. The morning ritual was always the same. Check the fences, count the cattle, inspect the chicken coop for signs of coyotes, and ensure the water troughs were full. But beneath this routine lay another, one born of old habits that refused to die. His eyes constantly swept the horizon, noting anything out of place. The rifle mounted under the porch eave was cleaned weekly, though he hadn't fired it in years. The barn's hidden compartment, concealed behind a false wall, remained untouched, but never forgotten. "John!" Sarah called from the porch, her voice carrying across the yard. "Breakfast is ready and the Hendersons are coming by later about that." "Bull!" He nodded, taking one last look at the distant horizon before heading in. Tom Henderson was a good neighbor, one of the few people in the area they'd come to trust. His teenage son had been helping out during the busy seasons, learning the trade from a man he saw as nothing more than a skilled rancher. At the breakfast table, Sarah reached for his hand, her touch gentle against his calloused palm. "You're worried about something," she said. Not a question, but a statement born of years of reading his silences. "Just thinking about the dry season ahead," he replied, the lie sitting uncomfortably in his mouth. He'd been watching dust clouds to the south for 3 days now, too deliberate in their movement to be cattle drives, too numerous to be ordinary travelers. Sarah's eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary, and he wondered, not for the first time, how much she suspected about his past. She was too smart not to have noticed the little things, the way he positioned himself in rooms to face the door, how he could read approaching riders before they crested the hill, the nightmares that still occasionally gripped him in the dark hours before dawn. John finished his breakfast methodically, savoring each bite of Sarah's cooking, while his mind catalogued the preparations he might need to make. The leather journal in his desk drawer hadn't been opened in years, its pages filled with encrypted notes from another life, but his fingers itched to verify certain details he'd tried so hard to forget. "I'll be in town this afternoon," Sarah mentioned, clearing the plates. "We're low on flour, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned something about a sewing circle." "Take the wagon," John said, rising to help with the dishes. "The buckboard needs work anyway." The wagon was slower, but more stable, and he'd reinforced its sides years ago with steel plates, another habit he couldn't quite shake. As Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing a kiss to his weathered cheek, John held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and home. Everything he'd built here, everything he'd become, was wrapped up in this woman who'd given him a chance at redemption. The thought of anything threatening this peace made his trigger finger twitch, a ghost of muscle memory he'd hoped to leave behind. Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. John watched Sarah's preparations for town through the window, his hand absently tracing the edge of the kitchen table where, unknown to anyone but himself, a Bowie knife lay secured in a hidden sheath, ready for the day he prayed would never come. After Sarah departed for town, John found himself drawn to his study, a sparse room that held more secrets than books. Behind, a loose floorboard beneath his desk, lay a tin box he hadn't opened in nearly 5 years. The metal was cool against his fingers as he lifted it free, dust dancing in the afternoon light. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings told the story of Black Jack Malone, though none carried his true likeness. The wanted posters showed a younger man, dark-haired and dangerous, with a reward that had grown to $10,000 before he vanished. John touched the aged paper, remembering the weight of the black duster coat that had been his trademark, the distinctive pearl-handled revolvers that had earned him his reputation. 15 years ago, he'd been a different man. Black Jack Malone had ruled the territories between Texas and Mexico with calculated precision. He wasn't like other outlaws. No random violence, no unnecessary casualties. His targets were always carefully chosen. Corrupt bank owners who'd foreclosed on farmers during the drought, cattle barons who'd stolen land from smaller ranchers, crooked lawmen who served themselves instead of justice. It had started as revenge for his family's lost ranch, but somewhere along the way, it had become something else. The turning point came during a raid on the First National Bank of Del Rio. He'd planned everything perfectly, as always. But that day, a young teller named Sarah Mason had looked him in the eye and said something that changed everything. Whatever they did to make you this way, it doesn't have to define who you'll become. John closed his eyes, remembering how those words had struck him deeper than any bullet. Sarah hadn't shown fear that day, even with his gun drawn. Instead, she'd seen through the legend to the wounded man beneath. When the robbery went sideways and shots were fired, he'd chosen to save her from a trigger-happy deputy rather than grab the money. That decision had cost him his crew's loyalty, but had given him something far more valuable. The old leather journal beside the newspaper clippings contained encoded details of every job, every contact, every safe house he'd ever used. More importantly, it held information about every rival gang and corrupt official he'd encountered. He'd kept it as insurance, knowing that in this line of work, the past had a way of finding you. Sarah had waited for him 3 months after the failed robbery, standing in the rain outside the Del Rio church. She'd known he'd come back, known it with a certainty that still amazed him. "I've been watching you for longer than you think. John Harrison," she'd said, using the name he'd given her during their brief encounters in town. "You're not as good at hiding your heart as you think you are." Their courtship had been careful, conducted in secret, while he systematically dismantled his criminal empire. Every cache of money was donated anonymously to orphanages and widows' funds. Every piece of information about corrupt officials found its way to honest marshals. His crew scattered to the winds, believing their leader had been killed in a dramatic shootout, a story he'd carefully orchestrated. John ran his fingers over the rough leather of the journal's cover, remembering the day he'd chosen this remote piece of Texas land to build their new life. Sarah had stood beside him, squinting at the endless horizon, and said, "This is where we'll grow old together." She'd believed in his redemption more than he had himself. But now, as he carefully returned the box to its hiding place, John couldn't shake the feeling that his past was catching up to them. The world was changing. Railroads and telegraph lines were shrinking the territories, making it harder for men to vanish and reinvent themselves. The old ways were dying, but old debts had a way of outliving their time. He moved to the window, watching dust devils dance across the yard where Sarah's morning flowers swayed in the hot breeze. Everything they'd built here was honest, earned, through sweat and determination. The calluses on his hands now came from mending fences and breaking horses, not from endless hours of gun practice. But beneath those honest calluses, his trigger finger still knew its work. A distant horse's whinny caught his attention. Tom Henderson's boy was riding in, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. But something was wrong. The boy's posture was too rigid, his approach too direct. John's hand instinctively moved to where his gun belt used to ride, finding only empty air. Times were changing indeed, but perhaps not as much as he'd hoped. Tom Henderson's boy, Billy, practically fell from his horse in his hurry to reach the porch. His face was flushed with more than just the afternoon heat, and John's practiced eye caught the tremor in the young man's hands as he clutched a crumpled telegram. "Mr. Harrison," Billy gasped. "Pa sent me to show you this. Came in from Fort Worth this morning." John took the paper, noting how the boy's eyes kept darting to the horizon behind him. The message was brief but clear. "Martinez gang moving north. Stop 5 ranches hit past month. Stop warn all isolated homesteads. Stop." "Your pa at the house?" John asked, his voice deliberately calm as he folded the telegram. "Yes, sir. He's gathering. The neighbors tonight. Says everyone needs to hear about this." Billy shifted uncomfortably. "The Martinez boys. They're not like other outlaws, sir. They burn what they can't take." John nodded slowly, remembering whispered conversations from his past life about the Martinez family. They'd been small-time then, but ambitious, with a reputation for cruelty that had made even hardened criminals wary. "Tell your pa I'll be there. And Billy," the boy turned back, "take the East Road home. It's longer, but the sight lines are better." After Billy rode off, John stood on his porch, scanning the territory with new eyes. The ranch's isolation, once its greatest comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. The Martinez gang wouldn't be the first to think an aging rancher and his wife made easy targets, but they might be the most dangerous to try. Sarah returned as the sun was setting, the wagon loaded with supplies. John watched her approach from the barn, noting how she too chose the East Road. His wife's instincts had always been sharp. It was one of the many things that had drawn him to her. "I heard things in town," she said later, as they sat at the kitchen table. The evening light cast long shadows across her face, reminding John of that rain-soaked day in Del Rio when she'd offered him a chance at redemption. Martha Henderson was crying at the general store, their cousin's ranch near Fort Worth. "I know," John interrupted gently. Billy brought the telegram. He reached across the table, taking her hand. "The Hendersons are gathering everyone tonight." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "They say the Martinez gang leaves no witnesses, John, that they enjoy making examples of those who resist." Her voice was steady, but he could feel the slight tremor in her grip. "Maybe we should consider—" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he softened his tone. "This is our home, Sarah. Everything we've built, everything we are, is here." She studied him in the fading light, and he saw the same clarity in her eyes that had pierced through his disguise 15 years ago. "Then we'll need supplies from the root cellar," she said simply. "I'll make a list." The root cellar. John hadn't opened the false wall there in years, but behind it lay enough ammunition to fight a small war. Sarah had never mentioned it, just as she never mentioned the other caches around the ranch, but he knew she was aware of them all. "I'll need to check the north pasture fence before heading to the Hendersons," he said, standing. They both knew. He wasn't going to check any fences. The ranch's defensive preparations, neglected but not forgotten, would need to be reinstated. "John!" Sarah's voice stopped him at the door. "Whatever happens, I've never regretted a single day here with you." He turned back, seeing not just the strong, graceful woman she'd become, but also the brave young teller who'd risked everything to believe in him. "Nor I with you." The evening air carried the scent of sage and creosote as John made his way to the barn. Inside, beneath the floorboards of an empty stall, lay a oiled canvas bundle he'd promised himself he'd never need to open again. The pearl-handled revolvers within had been part of what made Jack Malone a legend, but it was the man Sarah believed in who would now use them to protect their home. As he worked, John's mind drifted to the Martinez gang's reputation. They were said to be 20 strong, led by 3 brothers who shared none of the odd honor code he'd lived by in his outlaw days. They killed for pleasure as much as profit, and they were heading this way. The old skills flowed back naturally, checking sight lines, planning fields of fire, preparing fallback positions. By the time he rode out to the Hendersons, the ranch was quietly ready for war. He just prayed it would be enough. The Martinez gang arrived 3 days later, their approach heralded by the dawn chorus of desert birds falling suddenly silent. John was already awake, dressed in the simple clothes of a rancher, though his movements as he peered through the bedroom window held none of the stiffness he normally affected. Sarah stirred beside him, her eyes opening with immediate clarity. "They're here," she whispered, no trace of sleep in her voice. They'd been waiting for this moment, preparing in quiet ways that never broke their normal routine. 11 riders, John murmured, counting the dust plumes approaching from the south. They're splitting up to circle the property. His tactical assessment was automatic, born of years reading terrain and men's intentions. The main force will come up the drive, but they're sending flankers wide to cut off any escape routes. Sarah rose and dressed efficiently, her movements calm and practiced. They'd discussed this moment, planned for it, though both had prayed it wouldn't come. "I'll start breakfast," she said, as if this were any other morning. "They'll be hungry. Men like that always are." John caught her arm gently as she passed. "Remember—" "I remember." She cut him off with a soft smile. "I'm just a simple rancher's wife. I know nothing of value, and I keep them talking while you play your part." She touched his cheek, her fingers lingering on the stubble there. "I married a good man named John Harrison, and that's all I've ever known." He watched her leave, admiring her courage, even as his heart ached at what was to come. The woman who'd once seen through Jack Malone's facade was about to give the performance of her life, and all he could do was play his own role and pray he'd prepared enough. The gang's approach was textbook intimidation. Horses' hooves deliberately thundering in the yard, men shouting and laughing too loudly, a few warning shots fired into the air. John waited until they started pounding on the front door before shuffling out of the bedroom, making sure to catch his foot on the loose floorboard that always creaked. "Coming, coming!" he called out, his voice pitched higher than normal, adding a slight quaver that suggested fear rather than age. "Please, no need for violence." He opened the door to find exactly what he expected. 3 men on the porch, with others visible in the yard behind them. All wore distinctive silver spurs that caught the morning light, a Martinez gang trademark meant to inspire fear. The leader stood front and center, his black vest decorated with silver conchos that had been polished to a mirror shine. This would be Ramon Martinez, the eldest of the brothers and the brains of the operation, if John's intelligence from years past still held true. "Good morning, old man," Ramon said, his accent thick but his English precise. "We've ridden far and could use some hospitality." His smile never reached his eyes, which were already scanning past John into the house. Of course," John stammered, stepping back with carefully orchestrated awkwardness. "My wife is just preparing breakfast. We don't get many visitors out here, but you're welcome to—" "Shut up," one of the other men snarled, shoving past him. John recognized him from descriptions as Luis Martinez, the youngest and most volatile of the brothers. The third man, who must be Miguel Martinez, said nothing but moved with the fluid grace of a practiced killer. The smell of coffee and biscuits wafted from the kitchen, along with Sarah's clear voice. "John, are these the visitors you mentioned might be coming by?" Her tone was perfectly pitched, curious but not fearful, friendly but not overly so. Ramon's eyebrows rose slightly at her composure. "Senora," he called out, "your hospitality is appreciated, but let us speak plainly. We know about the bank deposits you and your husband have been making. Regular cash amounts, too large for a simple ranching operation." John let his face show confusion and fear, though inside he was grudgingly impressed. They'd done their homework, tracking the legitimate profits from his careful cattle breeding program. The deposits, those are just from our prize bulls, he explained, wringing his hands. We've developed a strong bloodline that the big ranches. Luis's backhand caught him across the face, sending him stumbling. John made sure to fall badly, looking every bit the frail old man as he collapsed against the wall. Sarah's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway was genuine. They hadn't discussed him taking actual hits. Every ranch we visit has a story, Ramon said, his voice almost gentle. But stories don't matter. What matters is that you have something we want, and we are going to take it. The only question is how much pain will be involved in the process. Sarah stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. Please, she said, her voice trembling just enough. We're simple people. Take whatever you want, just don't hurt anyone. Miguel Martinez moved then, so fast that even John was impressed. One moment Sarah was standing in the doorway, the next she was held firmly with a knife at her throat. The deed to the ranch, Miguel said, his voice surprisingly soft. The bank papers, all of it. Now, John pulled himself up, letting genuine anger show through his facade for just a moment before covering it with fear. In my study. The desk. He looked at Sarah, seeing the trust in her eyes even as Miguel's blade pressed against her skin. I'll get everything. Luis, go with him, Ramon ordered. Search the room thoroughly. Old men like to hide things. He settled himself at the kitchen table, helping himself to a biscuit. Miguel, bring the woman here where I can see her, but keep the knife ready. Breakfast smells too good to waste, and I think we'll all be more comfortable while we wait. John shuffled toward his study, every fiber of his being wanting to turn and end this now, but the timing wasn't right. There were still too many men outside, too many angles to cover. Luis shoved him roughly through the study door, and John let himself stumble again. Hurry up, old man, Luis spat, his hand resting on his gun. I don't have your wife at knife point, but I can still make you hurt. John moved to his desk, his hands shaking as he opened the drawer. 15 years of peace stretched behind him, but as he touched the false bottom that held his land deed, other memories surfaced. Gunfights and ambushes, the weight of his revolvers, and the smell of gun smoke. Jack Malone had been a ghost for a long time, but ghosts, he reflected, had a way of returning when violence threatened all you held dear. The deed's right here, he said, his voice quavering as he handed over the papers. Please, it's all we have. Luis snatched the documents, scanning them quickly before tucking them into his vest. Not anymore, old-timer, not anymore. Back in the kitchen, John catalogued every detail through eyes that appeared dampened by fear, but missed nothing. Ramon Martinez sat at their table like a king holding court, his silver-studded vest catching morning light from the window. Sarah moved with deliberate efficiency, serving coffee and biscuits, while Miguel's knife remained a constant threat. Outside, 8 more men were visible through the windows, spreading through the property with practiced coordination. John's hands shook as he poured coffee, deliberately spilling some. Sorry, he mumbled, watching as Luis entered the kitchen with their land deed. Each trembling movement allowed him to shift position slightly, building a mental map of the room's angles and obstacles, the heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove, the distance to the hidden knife under the table, the loose floorboard that could provide an instant's distraction. Your wife is an excellent cook, Ramon said, breaking the tense silence. It would be a shame to spoil this pleasant breakfast with violence. He studied Sarah over the rim of his coffee cup. Tell me, Senora, how long have you been married to this simple rancher? Sarah's eyes met John's for the briefest moment. 15 years this spring, she answered truthfully, her voice steady despite Miguel's blade. 15 years, Ramon mused. Interesting. About the same time the notorious Jack Malone disappeared. He watched their faces carefully, but found only confusion in John's expression and polite bewilderment in Sarah's. You've heard of Jack Malone, surely? Even out here in your peaceful little ranch? John lowered himself shakily into a chair, buying time to control his reaction. "Stories, just stories," he said, letting his voice waver. "They say he died in a shootout with rangers down near Del Rio." The lie tasted familiar. He'd started it himself all those years ago. Luis snorted from his position by the door. "The old man can barely hold his coffee cup, Ramon. You think he's some famous gunslinger?" "Perhaps not," Ramon conceded, though his eyes remained sharp. "But men can change greatly in 15 years, can't they, Senor Harrison?" John slumped further, radiating defeat while his mind raced. Ramon was fishing, but the questions were too specific to be random. Someone had talked, or some clue had survived despite his careful erasure of the past. He needed more time to understand what they knew, to position the pieces of this deadly game. "Please," he said, reaching for Sarah, only to have Miguel twist her away. "The deed is yours. Take what you want from the house. Just let my wife go." Ramon stood slowly, brushing biscuit crumbs from his vest. "Let us inspect our new property," he announced. "Miguel, bring the woman. She can show us where they keep their valuables. Luis, watch the old man. Shoot him if he moves from that chair." As they left the kitchen, John caught Sarah's eye again. A lifetime of understanding passed between them in that glance. She would play her part, keep them distracted. His role was to appear broken, harmless, while calculating every angle of what was to come. Luis lounged against the doorframe, obviously, bored with guard duty. "Getting old must be hard," he sneered. "Watching everything you've built be taken away, too weak to stop it." John stared at his trembling hands, spread on the kitchen table. Beneath the age spots and rancher's calluses lay older marks, powder burns, and the subtle deformations of trigger fingers. A man learns to accept what he cannot change," he said quietly. Upstairs, he heard Sarah's voice directing them to their bedroom, where only the most obvious valuables were kept. The real treasures, the weapons, the ammunition, the cached supplies, remained safely hidden. He'd built this ranch with invasion in mind, every secret compartment, and hidden cache designed for moments like this. Through the window, he watched the gang members in the yard. They were professional, maintaining clear fields of fire, watching the approaches. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed the aging rancher before them was the only threat they faced. They hadn't searched the barn yet, hadn't found the false wall that concealed his past. Most importantly, they hadn't recognized that Sarah's calm efficiency was more than just a housewife's practiced routine. Luis shifted impatiently, his attention drawn to the sounds of ransacking upstairs. John let his shoulders sag further. The picture of defeat, while his mind assembled and discarded plans with the precision that had once made Jack Malone a legend. A crash from upstairs made John flinch, not entirely an act. Even knowing Sarah could handle herself, each sound of their home being ransacked tested his restraint. Luis smirked at his reaction, clearly enjoying the old man's distress. "Water," John mumbled, his voice cracking. "Please, may I have some water?" Luis rolled his eyes but nodded, keeping his gun trained casually on John while gesturing toward the sink. John rose slowly, his movements stiff and pained. He'd learned long ago that the best way to hide strength was to show carefully calculated weakness. At the sink, his trembling hands fumbled with a glass, letting it clatter against the metal basin. The noise covered the slight scrape of his boot heel, checking the loose floorboard, still secure, still concealing the throwing knife. Beneath, he filled the glass awkwardly, spilling water across the counter. "Careful, old man," Luis taunted. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself before Ramon's finished upstairs." John shuffled back to his chair, apparently struggling with the full glass. His circuitous route allowed him to catalogue every weapon within reach. The cast-iron skillet, Sarah's heavy rolling pin, the decorative horseshoe mounted above the door that was actually weighted for throwing. More importantly, his wandering path confirmed his suspicion about Luis's stance. The youngest Martinez brother was fast, but he favored his left leg slightly, An old injury, perhaps, and a weakness to exploit when the time came. Sarah's wedding ring caught the morning light as Miguel marched her back into the kitchen, Ramon, following with a handful of jewelry and papers. The ring was a simple gold band, unremarkable, except to those who knew that its interior held a lockpick John had given her on their first anniversary. Some habits were too ingrained to break, even in retirement. "Your husband is being very cooperative," Ramon said to Sarah, his tone conversational, but his eyes cold. "I hope you're showing my brothers the same courtesy upstairs." "They've seen everything we have," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite Miguel's knife still at her throat. She met John's gaze briefly, a subtle shake of her head indicating the gang hadn't found any of their hidden caches. Ramon settled back at the table, absently toying with Sarah's mother's cameo brooch. "It's strange," he mused. "For a simple ranch, you have so many little hiding places. The false bottom in the desk drawer, the hollow space behind the bedroom mirror, almost as if—" He paused, studying John's face. "You were used to concealing things." John let his hands shake harder, slopping water onto the table. "The depression," he stammered. "We learned to hide what little we had. Everyone did back then. The depression." "Of course." Ramon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miguel, perhaps our hosts would be more forthcoming in the barn. I've noticed the old man glancing that direction several times." John's heart quickened, but he kept his expression fearful. The barn gambit was deliberate, testing his reaction. "There's nothing in the barn," he protested weakly. "Just tools. And feed. We'll see." Ramon stood smoothly. "Luis, bring him. If he resists, shoot the woman." The walk to the barn was a careful performance. John stumbled twice, letting Luis rough him up while cataloguing the positions of the gang members in the yard. 8 men, all armed with revolvers and Winchester rifles. 2 watching the road, 3 near the corral, 3 more checking outbuildings. Professional spacing, but their focus was outward, watching for approach rather than considering threats from within. Inside the barn, warm darkness wrapped around them. John blinked repeatedly, playing at age-weakened eyes while his vision adapted. Quickly, every shadow held memories. The tack room where his gun belt lay hidden, the loose stall board concealing extra ammunition, the hayloft with its secret compartment holding the black duster coat he'd hoped never to wear again. "Search it," Ramon ordered. "Every corner, every shadow." Miguel pushed Sarah onto a hay bale, keeping his knife ready while Luis began pulling tack off the walls. John watched, shoulders slumped, as they methodically moved through the barn. They were thorough, professional, but they weren't looking in the right places. They saw an old man's barn, not a gunfighter's armory. "The floor," Ramon said suddenly. "Check for loose boards." John tensed internally but maintained his facade of helpless anxiety. They were getting closer to dangerous ground now. Soon he would have to decide. Maintain the deception and risk them actually finding something, or begin the end game while they were split between house and barn. Sarah caught his eye, her hand moving slightly toward her wedding ring. She'd already made her decision, was ready to act. After 15 years of marriage, he could read her signals as clearly as she could read his. The time for waiting was nearly over. Luis's boot heel struck another floorboard, the hollow sound echoing through the barn. John watched through lowered eyes as Ramon's head snapped toward the noise. They were 3 boards away from the cache containing his custom revolvers, the pearl-handled weapons that had been Jack Malone's signature. "Here," Ramon called out, kneeling to examine the spot. "This one's different." Sarah's fingers moved to her wedding ring again, twisting it slowly. The morning sun through the barn slats caught the gold band, sending a familiar pattern of light across the wall, a signal they'd developed years ago. She was ready. John shifted his weight imperceptibly, testing the give of the floorboard. Beneath his left boot, "Senor Harrison," Ramon said, his voice deceptively gentle, "would you care to explain why an honest rancher needs a hidden compartment in his barn floor?" Before John could stammer another excuse, Miguel's grip on Sarah, suddenly tightened. "Brother," he called out, his quiet voice carrying clearly. "Her ring. Look at how she holds it." The next few seconds stretched like molasses. John saw Ramon's eyes narrow with recognition, saw the subtle shift in his stance that preceded drawing his gun. Behind him, Luis was already reaching for his revolver, but his weight was on his weak leg. Sarah's fingers closed around her ring, ready to access the lockpick within. "Time to choose." "Sarah," John said quietly, his voice dropping the quaver it had carried all morning. "Remember Dodge City?" Her eyes lit with understanding. "Like dancing," she replied calmly, and then moved. The speed with which she drove her elbow into Miguel's solar plexus would have surprised anyone who hadn't seen her practicing that exact move for 15 years. As the knife at her throat wavered, she ducked and twisted, the techniques John had taught her flowing smoothly. Miguel's blade clattered to the floor as Sarah rolled toward the tack room. John was already moving. The floorboard beneath his boot came up with practiced pressure, sending a spray of dust into Luis's eyes. His stumble onto his weak leg was all the opening John needed. 15 years of muscle memory took over as he swept the younger man's feet, simultaneously relieving him of his revolver. Ramon's gun cleared its holster with impressive speed, but he was still turning toward the wrong threat. His first shot splintered the wall where John had been standing a heartbeat before. His second shot never came. The heavy horseshoe from the barn door caught him in the wrist with mathematical precision. "Don't," John said quietly. Luis's revolver now trained steadily on Ramon's head. All trace of the feeble old rancher had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. "Miguel, step away from the tack room, or I'll put a bullet through your brother's eye." Miguel froze, his hand halfway to his backup gun. He'd been ready to shoot at where Sarah had rolled, but something in John's voice, the cold certainty of a man intimate with violence, made him reconsider. "You," Ramon breathed, cradling his injured wrist. "It's not possible. Black Jack Malone died in Del Rio. Everyone knows this." "Stories," John replied, his aim never wavering. "Just stories." Sarah reappeared from the tack room, John's gun belt in her hands. The twin, pearl-handled revolvers hung heavy with deadly promise. 15 years, she said, her voice carrying a hint of steel that matched her husband's, "and you boys just had to come poking around." "The others will hear," Ramon warned, though his bravado had faded. 8 more men, all experienced killers. John smiled, and both Martinez brothers felt a chill at the expression. It was the smile of a wolf who'd been asked to play sheepdog, now given permission to bare his teeth. 8 men who were about to learn why even other outlaws feared crossing Black Jack Malone. "You're too old," Luis spat from the floor, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. 15 years is a long time. "Age just means I won't enjoy this like I used to," John replied, smoothly disarming Miguel with his free hand while keeping Ramon covered. "Sarah, would you do the honors?" She moved with practiced efficiency, using Miguel's own rope to bind the 3 brothers. Her knots were perfect, another skill John had insisted she master. "Just like dancing," she said again, but this time there was a hardness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Outside, the gang members continued their patrol, unaware that the dynamic inside the barn had shifted dramatically. John buckled on his gun belt, the familiar weight settling like a ghost made flesh. "Remember what you said in Del Rio?" he asked Sarah softly. "About not letting the past define who I'd become." She checked the brothers' bonds one final time. "The past doesn't define you, John, but it did teach you how to protect what matters." She met his eyes. "Those men out there threatened our home." John nodded, drawing both revolvers with a smoothness that belied his apparent age. "So they did." He turned to the Martinez brothers, his voice dropping to the quiet tone that had once made hardened gunmen step aside. "Now, let's discuss how this ends." John moved to the barn door, his steps silent despite his age. Peering through a gap in the weathered wood, he assessed the gang members' positions with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades reading battlefield dynamics in an instant. 3 by the corral, 2 watching the road, 3 checking outbuildings, he murmured to Sarah, who was retrieving additional ammunition from another hidden cache. They're maintaining professional spacing, but their focus is outward, expecting trouble from outside, not within. Just like Del Rio, Sarah replied softly, loading spare shells into a worn leather bandolier. Though there were more of them then, Ramon stirred against his bonds. You're outnumbered. Even if you were once Black Jack Malone, you're not young anymore. My men are killers. Your men are predictable, John corrected, never taking his eyes off the yard. Professional, yes, but predictable. They're positioned exactly where I would have put them 15 years ago. He glanced at Sarah. The root cellar, ready, she confirmed. Tommy Henderson's been keeping the mechanisms oiled, though he thinks they're just storm shutters. John allowed himself a small smile. The Henderson boys' weekly maintenance work had been more valuable than the lad knew. Every escape route, every hidden cache, every defensive position had been regularly checked under the guise of routine ranch work. The men you're facing aren't common rustlers, Miguel said, his quiet voice carrying an edge of warning. They've killed dozens. Numbers don't matter much, John replied, checking the load in his pearl-handled revolvers. The familiar weight felt like greeting an old friend. Your men are used to overwhelming force against weaker targets. They're not prepared for someone who's spent 15 years designing this entire ranch as a tactical position. Sarah moved to another window, her movements precise and controlled. 6 minutes until the Henderson boy makes his regular morning ride past the north fence, she noted. Unless you scared him off earlier. He'll come, John said with certainty. Tom Henderson's boy has his father's stubbornness. He'll have warned the others, but he'll make his ride to show he's not afraid. He turned to the Martinez brothers. Your men are about to be very distracted. Luis spat on the floor. You're still just an old man playing at being a legend. John's response was to draw and aim at a rusted can on the far wall, his movement so smooth it seemed almost casual. The shot cracked out like thunder, and the can flew from its perch with a hole dead center. Age just means I've had more practice, he said quietly, the revolver disappearing back into its holster before the echo faded. Sarah finished organizing their supplies, every movement efficient and purposeful. The storage shed? Too obvious. As a first move, John replied. They'll expect us to try for it. We'll use the root cellar route first, circle around through the wash. Get behind their outer perimeter before they realize we've moved. He checked his timepiece. 4 minutes. Until Tommy's ride, that's our window. Ramon watched the exchange with growing unease. The comfortable domesticity between the aging couple had transformed into something else. The smooth coordination of long-time partners who'd faced danger together. You can't expect to take on 8 armed men by yourself. He won't be by. Himself, Sarah said calmly, checking the revolver she'd retrieved from the tack room. At the brothers' surprised looks, she smiled. 15 years is a long time to practice, even for a former bank teller. John moved to the barn's rear wall, pressing a series of knots in the wood in quick succession. A section of the floor, silently, sank and slid aside, revealing a steep stairway. When the shooting starts, he told the bound brothers, I suggest you stay very still. Sarah's a better shot than I am at anything under 20 yards, and she never quite forgave your men for threatening her home. Ready? Sarah asked, taking up position by the barn door. John nodded, settling his black hat low over his eyes. The familiar gesture completed the transformation. The gentle rancher was gone, replaced by something much older and more dangerous. Like you said, just like Del Rio. Only this time, we have home field advantage. Outside, a horse's hooves could be heard approaching the north fence. Tommy Henderson's morning ride was right on schedule. John met Sarah's eyes one last time, saw the same calm determination there that had first drawn him to her 15 years ago. "Time to remind them," he said softly, "why they used to tell stories about Black Jack Malone." Tommy Henderson's horse appeared right on schedule, the boy's silhouette clear against the morning sky. The gang members by the corral tensed, weapons ready, but maintained their positions, exactly as John had predicted. Their discipline was what he'd counted on. "Now," he whispered to Sarah, and they moved like shadows through the root cellar passage. The tunnel, disguised as a simple storm shelter, led them 20 yards beyond the barn. John had built it himself, marking the distance by careful steps, ensuring that its exit would be concealed by the natural fold of land that creased their property. They emerged behind a stand of scrub brush, just as Tommy's arrival drew the attention of the gang's outriders. The boy rode slowly, deliberately, his posture straight despite his fear. John felt a surge of pride. The lad had courage. "The three by the storage shed first," John murmured, his voice barely a breath. "They're the closest to reinforcements." Sarah nodded, shifting her grip on her revolver. 15 years of morning target practice was about to prove its worth. The first man fell without a sound, Sarah's shot catching him perfectly as John had taught her, high in the chest where the lungs collapse would prevent any cry of alarm. Before his body hit the ground, John's first shot had taken the second man, the sound masked by Tommy's horse's hooves. The third man began to turn at some instinct, but he was too late. John's second shot caught him clean, and Sarah's follow-up ensured he wouldn't be getting up. 3 men down in less than 4 seconds, and the remaining gang members were still watching Tommy's approach. "Like threading needles," Sarah whispered, the old code phrase bringing a grim smile to John's lips. In their early days together, when she'd insisted on learning to shoot, he'd compared precise targeting to her sewing, an art of patience and perfect placement. They moved like water through the scrub brush, using the contours of land John had spent 15 years memorizing. Every dip, every rise, every shadow had been noted and measured for moments just like this. The next position put them within striking distance of the 2 men watching the road. These shots would be trickier. The angle was worse, and sound would carry differently here. John reached into his boot and produced a small brass whistle, the kind ranchers used for dogs. The sharp, brief note he blew could have been any local farmer calling their herd. Both men turned slightly toward the sound, presenting better angles. This time, Sarah took the shot on the right, while John handled the left. 2 more bodies fell, silently into the tall grass. 5 down, Sarah counted softly, automatically reloading even though her revolver still held rounds. Another habit John had drilled into her over the years. The remaining 3 men were the veterans, positioned near the house where they could maintain sight lines on multiple approaches. But they were watching the wrong threats, their attention divided between Tommy's obvious approach and the directions from which they expected trouble. They never thought to watch the ground itself, where John and Sarah crept through a shallow drainage ditch that John had deliberately left unrepaired over the years. Every spring, Sarah had complained about it for show, while John had carefully maintained its depth and cover. At precisely the right moment, Tommy Henderson reached the fence line and called out a greeting, his young voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Mr. Harrison, got a message from Pa about that bull?" The gang members shifted uneasily, weapons ready but unwilling to shoot an innocent boy in broad daylight. That moment of distraction was all John needed. He rose from the ditch like a ghost. From his own grave, both pearl-handled revolvers catching the sun. The first man died before he could register the threat. The second managed half a turn before joining him. The third got off a wild shot that kicked up dust far from its target. John's return fire was methodical, almost elegant. 2 shots in quick succession, placed with surgical precision. The last gang member crumpled, his silver spurs glinting one final time as he fell. 8 men in 20 seconds, Sarah noted, maintaining her cover position even though the threat was ended. "You've slowed down, love. Used to be you could do it in 15. John holstered his revolvers with the same smooth grace that had made him a legend. "Age teaches patience," he replied. But there was a familiar glint in his eye, the satisfaction of a job done right. "Tommy!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent yard. "Ride home, son. Tell your pa I'll be along shortly to explain about the bull." The boy's eyes were wide as he wheeled his horse, having witnessed something few living people had seen, why Black Jack Malone's name had once been whispered with fear and awe throughout the territories. But there would be time for explanations later. Right now, they had 3 bound brothers in the barn and 8 bodies to deal with. "Just like Del Rio?" Sarah asked, rising to join him. "Better," John replied, taking her hand. "This time, we get to keep our home." The morning sun climbed higher as John and Sarah worked with practiced efficiency. Each body was carefully searched, weapons and ammunition collected, and any identifying items catalogued. John paid particular attention to a gold pocket watch. He found on one of the men Mexican silverwork with an ornate M engraved on its cover. "This isn't just a gang token," he said, studying the craftsmanship. "This is cartel work. The Martinez brothers have deeper connections than I thought." Sarah paused in her methodical collection of gun belts and ammunition. "You think there will be more coming?" "Not think. No." John's voice was grim as he pocketed the watch. "The cartels don't forget debts or slights, especially not with 3 Martinez brothers trussed up in our barn." They worked in silence for a few more minutes. The familiar rhythm of cleaning up violence, settling over them like an old coat found in the back of a closet. Some skills never quite left you, no matter how many peaceful years passed. "The boy will talk," Sarah said finally, gathering the last of the weapons into a burlap sack. "Tommy saw enough to start stories spreading." John nodded, surveying their work. 8 bodies, laid out with almost military precision behind the barn, nothing left to identify them except their distinctive silver spurs. Stories might work in our favor. Black Jack Malone coming back from the dead will make some think twice about riding in here, and draw others looking to make a name for themselves, Sarah countered, though her tone was more practical than worried. She'd learned long ago that fear was a luxury they couldn't afford in moments like these. A sound from the barn drew their attention, one of the Martinez brothers shifting against his bonds. John's hand moved to his revolver, but Sarah touched his arm. "I'll handle them. You need to think about our next move." Inside the barn, Ramon watched Sarah enter with new eyes. The efficient woman before him bore little resemblance to the quiet rancher's wife of an hour ago. She checked their bonds with professional attention, then pulled up a chair to face them. 8 men, Ramon said quietly. 8 experienced killers in less than a minute. The stories about him, they weren't exaggerated. "They left out the best parts," Sarah replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "The stories never mentioned that Black Jack Malone never killed without reason, never robbed those who couldn't afford the loss. They didn't talk about how he helped widows keep their ranches, or how he made sure corrupt bankers paid their fair share." Louis spat on the floor. "He was still a murderer." "No," Sarah corrected, cleaning her revolver with practiced moves. "He was a surgeon. Every shot, every action had purpose, like removing a cancer before it could spread." She looked up, meeting Ramon's eyes. "Like he did this morning, stopping your kind of cancer from spreading across our land." Miguel, who had been silent until now, spoke in his soft voice. "The cartel will come. Our Uncle Diego won't let this stand." "Diego Martinez," Sarah mused, never pausing in her weapon maintenance. "The one who's been pushing north from Mexico, taking over the border territories?" At their surprised looks, she smiled thinly. 15 years of peace doesn't mean we stopped paying attention. We know exactly who you work for." Outside, they heard hoofbeats approaching, multiple riders moving fast. Sarah's grip tightened on her revolver, but the familiar whistle that followed relaxed her shoulders. John's signal, all clear. He entered moments later, his expression tight. "Tom." Henderson and 4 others from town, they heard the shots. He looked at Sarah. "It's starting." Ramon laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "Your quiet life is over, old man. By sundown, every gun hand and bounty hunter within 100 miles will know Black Jack Malone lives." "Good," John said, his voice carrying that quiet. certainty that had made him legendary. Let them come. Every man who rides up here looking for the ghost of Black Jack Malone is one less riding for Diego Martinez. Sarah stood, her movements smooth and controlled. I'll make coffee. Tom Henderson's a good man, but he'll want explanations. She paused at the door, looking back at the brothers. And he's also the county sheriff now. Something your men were too busy mocking the old rancher to discover. As she left, John settled into the chair she'd vacated, his eyes never leaving the Martinez brothers. The pearl handles of his revolvers caught the light filtering through the barn slats, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. Here was the man who had once made even hardened killers hesitate, whose very name had been enough to make men choose different paths. "Now then," he said softly, drawing the gold watch from his pocket, "let's talk about Uncle Diego, and exactly what he's going to find when he sends men to look for you." Tom Henderson's arrival brought the weight of law to the Harrison ranch, though not in the way the Martinez brothers might have hoped. The sheriff took in the scene with the measured calm of a man who'd spent decades reading situations before, passing judgment. His weathered badge caught the late morning sun as he dismounted, his deputies spreading out with practiced efficiency. "Quite a mess you've got here, John," Tom said, his voice carefully neutral as he surveyed the row of bodies behind the barn. "Though I reckon these boys brought it on themselves." John stood beside his old friend, noting how Tom's hand never strayed far from his gun, despite their years of friendship. "Smart man." "They threatened Sarah," he said simply, "and that's all I need for my report." Tom nodded, then dropped his voice. "But we both know there's more to this than a rancher defending his wife. Those silver spurs aren't just for show. These are Martinez men." Before John could respond, Sarah emerged from the house carrying a wooden box he'd never seen before. Her steps were deliberate as she approached the two men, and something in her bearing made John straighten. He knew every expression his wife could make, every subtle shift of her posture. This was something new. "Tom," she said, "I think it's time we showed John what really happened in Del Rio." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with understanding. "Reckon you're right, Sarah. Been 15 years of carrying that secret." John looked between them, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet in a way 8 dead gunmen hadn't managed. "What secret?" Sarah opened the box, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and what looked like official documents. "The day you came. To rob the First National Bank of Del Rio," she began, her voice steady, "wasn't the first time I'd seen Black Jack Malone in action." From the barn doorway, Ramon Martinez listened intently. His professional interest piqued despite his situation. Even Luis and Miguel leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. "6 months before," Sarah continued, drawing out an old newspaper clipping, "you robbed the Barrett Mining Company's payroll office. You left all the workers' wages, but took the owner's private safe. Inside was proof of how he'd been cheating his men, proof that mysteriously found its way to the territorial marshal's office." John's mind raced back. That job, no one knew about the safe except the secretary who always worked late on Thursdays, Sarah finished. "The one who made sure the proof of Barrett's crimes was separated from his other papers before you arrived." The implications slowly dawned on John. "You were the secretary and the school teacher in Laredo when you exposed the cattle barons. What a right scheme," she added, pulling out more papers. "And the telegraph operator in Sweetwater when you intercepted those land grab documents." A small smile played at her lips. "I moved around a lot in those days." Tom Henderson shifted, uncomfortably. "Sarah was working with us, a network of lawmen and honest folks trying to fight back against the corruption that was rotting the territory from the inside. We couldn't touch men like Barrett through legal means. They owned too many judges and too many politicians. So we found another way," Sarah said softly. "When we realized that the notorious Black Jack Malone was hitting the same targets we were investigating, only doing it more effectively, you started leaving him information." John finished, pieces of his past rearranging themselves like a kaleidoscope. All those jobs where the intelligence was perfect, where I knew exactly when and where to hit." Sarah nodded. "We didn't know your real name or face. You were too good at staying hidden. But we knew your pattern. You never hurt innocent people, never stole from those who couldn't afford it. You were surgical, strategic." "And then came Del Rio," Tom added. "Sarah was placed in the bank specifically to make contact. We needed your help with something bigger than local corruption, but things didn't go according to plan." "No," Sarah said, her eyes meeting John's, "because I didn't expect to fall in love with the man behind the legend." She pulled out one final document, a federal marshal's special dispensation dated 15 years ago. "When you decided to leave it all behind, to build an honest life, I requested a new assignment, deep cover, protecting a valuable asset, who might one day be needed again." John stared at his wife of 15 years, seeing her with new eyes. Every target practice session, every strategic discussion about the ranch's defenses, every careful preparation, she hadn't just been humoring him or learning for protection. She'd been maintaining operational readiness. "All these years," he said quietly, "you were watching over me." "All these years," she corrected, taking his hand, "I was watching over us. Building a life I'd only dreamed of while chasing corruption across the territory. Everything between us is real, John. I just had a few extra reasons for falling in love with you." From the barn, Ramon's voice carried a note of bitter amusement. "So the great Black Jack Malone, the terror of corrupt officials everywhere, was actually working for law and order all along?" "Not exactly," Tom said, his hand finally moving away from his gun. "John here was a genuine outlaw. He just happened to be hitting the same targets we were. Sarah's mission was to make contact, to potentially guide his activities toward our larger goals. She wasn't supposed to blow her cover, and she certainly wasn't supposed to marry him." He smiled slightly, though I can't say any of us complained about how it worked out. The territory got a lot cleaner in those years. "And now?" John asked, still processing this revelation about his wife and their life together. Sarah's expression turned serious. "Now, we have a cartel trying to move into the territory, using the same tactics the corrupt barons used 15 years ago. Diego Martinez isn't just a criminal, he's the kind of cancer we used to cut out." She squared her shoulders, every inch the federal agent she'd apparently never stopped being. "The network is still out there, John. Still fighting the same fights, and they could use Black Jack Malone's help one more time." John looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who had seen both sides of him and chosen to love them both, who had built a true life with him, while carrying out perhaps the longest deep-cover assignment in federal history. He thought about the peace they'd found here, the honest work and quiet days. Then he thought about men like Diego Martinez, about the corruption and violence creeping back into the territory, about young men like Tommy Henderson growing up in the shadow of that darkness. "Well," he said finally, a familiar glint coming into his eye, "I suppose Black Jack Malone still has one more job in him." He turned to Tom. "Sheriff, I believe you'll find enough evidence in that gold watch to justify holding the Martinez brothers for conspiracy." "And the bodies?" Tom asked professionally. "Killed while resisting arrest by your newly deputized special agents," Sarah supplied, producing another document from her box. "Signed by the territorial governor this morning when we sent word about the Martinez gang's movements. Sometimes the old networks move very quickly." John shook his head in amazement. "You've been preparing for this day for 15 years, haven't you?" "I've been preparing for us to do what we've always done best," she replied. "Fight the good fight, just from different angles." She smiled, touching the pearl handle of his revolver. "Together." Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Tom's deputies transported the Martinez brothers to the county jail. John stood on the porch, watching them go, while his mind worked through the implications of everything he'd learned. Behind him, Sarah and Tom pored over documents spread across their kitchen table. Intelligence reports, cartel movements, property deeds linking Diego Martinez to supposedly legitimate businesses across the territory. "Diego will have men watching the main roads," John said, turning back into the house. They'll know something's wrong by nightfall. Already taken care of, Sarah replied, without looking up from her papers. We've got trusted men at every telegraph office within 50 miles. As far as Diego knows, his nephews are still searching for profitable ranches to acquire. She glanced up, a familiar glint in her eye. Officially, they won't be missed for another 3 days. John settled into his chair, studying his wife with new appreciation. All these years, every time you went to your sewing circle, intelligence. Meetings, she confirmed. Martha Henderson isn't just Tom's wife. She runs the network's communications through that little quilting shop of hers. Those quilts she sends to shops across the territory? Coded messages sewn right into the patterns. Tom traced a line on one of his maps. Diego's been smart, building his empire slowly. Legitimate businesses buying up land, squeezing smaller ranchers with legal pressure. Man's got 3 judges in his pocket and enough lawyers to choke a courthouse. Just like Barrett Mining all those years ago, John mused, only on a much larger scale. He picked up the gold watch they'd taken from the gang member. But he's getting bolder, sending his own family in with guns instead of lawyers. That's a tactical mistake. Thunder rolled in the distance as Sarah sorted through more papers. He's getting impatient. Our networks have blocked his legal maneuvers too many times. He's starting to think like a cartel boss instead of a businessman. Good, John said, earning surprised looks from both of them. Men like Diego Martinez. They survive by playing 2 games at once. Respectable businessman in the light, criminal in the shadows. Push him hard enough, he'll have to choose. And men like him always choose the shadows. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding. Force him to show his true face. Give the federal marshals something they can't ignore. Exactly what you did to Barrett, Tom added. Only this time, you've got the law on your side from the start. The first drops of rain began to fall outside as John walked to the gun cabinet, no longer hiding his natural grace. He'll send men to find his nephews first. Good ones, experienced killers who can work quietly. 4 teams of 3, Sarah confirmed, pulling out another report. They're already in the territory, disguised as ranch hands and traders. Been tracking them for weeks. John ran his fingers over his pearl-handled revolvers, feeling the weight of the past and future converging. Names? Better than that, Sarah said, producing a series of detailed dossiers. We have their patterns, their preferred tactics, even their favorite horses. She smiled at John's raised eyebrow. The network's gotten more sophisticated in the past 15 years, love. Tom stood, buckling on his gun belt. I'll get my best deputies positioned. Ellen Henderson's already spreading word through the sewing circles. Any strangers asking questions about the Martinez boys will find themselves getting some interesting directions. The rain was falling steadily now, drumming on the roof of the home they'd built together. John watched Sarah move through the kitchen, efficiently preparing coffee while never taking her eyes off the maps and reports. Her movements were still those of his loving wife, but now he could see the steel beneath, the federal agent who'd chosen to blend her mission with her heart. Having second thoughts? She asked softly, catching his gaze. About us? Never. He moved to help her with the coffee. About coming out of retirement. Let's just say I'm grateful I kept in practice. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing gently. For what it's worth, I never doubted this day would come. Not because of who you were, but because of who you are. A good man who can't stand by while others suffer. Thunder crashed closer as Tom began gathering his papers. Storm's almost here, the sheriff said, and they all knew he wasn't just talking about the weather. John nodded, feeling the familiar clarity of purpose settling over him. Then let's make sure we're ready when it breaks. He looked at Sarah. Partners? Partners, she replied, her smile carrying 15 years of love and secrets finally brought to light. In everything. The storm passed by midnight, leaving behind a world washed clean and dark. John moved through the shadows of his property like a ghost, checking positions they'd prepared over the past 12 hours. The moon broke through occasionally, catching the silver inlay of his gun belt, the only part of his outfit that wasn't the pure black that had given him his name so many years ago. Sarah's voice came soft in the darkness, carried by a small tin whistle that sounded like a nightbird to anyone who didn't know better. Riders approaching from the South Wash, 3 men, moving quiet, right on schedule, John murmured, positioning himself behind an old oak tree. According to Sarah's intelligence, this would be Diego's best team, led by a man called El Coyote, known for tracking prey across impossible terrain. The riders emerged from the wash like shadows themselves, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle their steps. John watched them through narrowed eyes, noting their professional spacing and the way they constantly scanned their surroundings. These weren't common bandits. They were hunters, killers, who'd learned their trade in the worst parts of the border wars. A flash of silver from the house, Sarah signaling she had them in her sights from her position in the upper window. They'd argued about that earlier, his instinct to protect her warring with the knowledge that she was probably a better shot than him at night. "You've been covering my blind spots for 15 years, he'd finally conceded. No reason to stop now. The lead rider, El Coyote himself, judging by the distinctive rifle scabbard Sarah's reports had mentioned, raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just at the edge of the property. John could barely make out their whispered Spanish, but Sarah's daily practice with him over the years had kept his comprehension sharp. "The tracks are wrong," El Coyote was saying. "Too many horses came in, too few rode out." "The brothers' horses are still in the barn," one of his men replied. "I can see them from here." "Sigh, but where are the other riders? 8 men don't just vanish." John smiled grimly in the darkness. Time to begin the game. He pulled out his own tin whistle, producing the call of a western screech owl, a bird that didn't live in these parts. El Coyote's head snapped up immediately, recognizing the deliberate wrongness of the sound. "It's a trap," he hissed, but John was already moving. The first shot came from Sarah, the crack of her rifle shattering the night silence. The bullet struck the ground inches from El Coyote's horse, making it rear in panic. His men's horses, startled by the sudden sound and motion, began to stamp and snort. John's voice, carried across the yard, pitched to echo off the barn walls. "The Martinez boys can't come to the door right now, but I'd be happy to take a message for them." El Coyote's reaction was impressive. Instead of freezing or running, he rolled off his spooked horse and took cover behind a water trough. His men followed suit, showing the discipline that had made them Diego's best team, but they were looking in the wrong direction, expecting the threat to come from the house where the rifle shot had originated. "Black Jack Malone," El Coyote called out, his accented English carrying clearly. "The ghost himself. Diego said you might be involved when he heard about the silver spurs." "Smart man, your boss," John replied, his voice seeming to come from a different direction now. An old trick he'd learned in his outlaw days. Throw your voice, keep them guessing. Smarter than his nephews anyway. "We have orders to bring them back alive." "They're alive," Sarah's voice joined in, startling the men who'd been focused on John's location. "In a nice, comfortable jail cell, which is more than they deserve after threatening a lady in her own home." El Coyote barked orders in Spanish, sending his men creeping toward different positions. But John had spent 15 years planning for moments like this. Every piece of cover they might use had been carefully prepared. The water trough that was subtly angled to expose anyone behind it. The fence posts that weren't quite as solid as they looked. The shadows that concealed pitfalls. A sudden burst of moonlight caught John's pearl-handled revolvers as he stepped into view, 30 feet behind El Coyote's position. "I'm curious," he said conversationally, making all 3 men whirl to face him. "Did Diego tell you what happened to men who drew against me in the old days?" Their hands dropped to their guns, but the moment of hesitation as they processed his sudden appearance was all Sarah needed. Her second shot knocked El Coyote's hat off his head, a warning and a demonstration in one. "Here's what's going to happen," John continued, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that had once made him legend. "You're going to leave your guns, get on your horses, and ride back to Diego. Tell him his nephews are guests of the U.S. Marshal's office. He smiled, and there was nothing friendly in it. "And tell him Jack Malone sends his regards." El Coyote's reputation for survival hadn't been earned by chance. Even as John finished speaking, the tracker was moving, rolling sideways as his men opened fire. The night erupted in gunfire and muzzle flashes, bullets splintering wood where John had been standing a heartbeat before. But Jack Malone hadn't survived his own legendary career by standing still. He was already diving for new cover, both revolvers singing out in perfect rhythm. His first shot caught one of El Coyote's men in the shoulder, spinning him out of his hastily chosen hiding spot. The second shot disarmed him cleanly as he fell. Sarah's rifle cracked again from above, the sound echoing off the barn walls. Her target, El Coyote's second man, cried out as the bullet struck his gun hand. The weapon went flying, disappearing into the darkness as he clutched his bleeding fingers. "Two down!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying that same professional calm she'd used while serving coffee that morning. "The coyotes moving toward the barn," John smiled grimly. El Coyote was good. He'd recognized the kill zone they'd created in the open yard and was making for the apparent safety of the barn's shadows. But like every other piece of the ranch, the barn had been prepared for exactly this sort of fight. "Remember what you said about Diego's men being predictable?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of amusement. 10 paces forward, 3 left. John's memory flashed to the hidden tripwire they'd installed years ago, disguised as a loose board. Sure. Enough! El Coyote's next step was followed by a loud crash as the board swung up, catching him in the shin. The tracker stumbled, but didn't fall, turning the momentum into a roll that brought him behind a stack of old barrels. "Still think this is just a simple ranch?" John called out, moving to flank the barrels. "Every shadow, every board, every piece of cover. We've had 15 years to prepare this ground." El Coyote's laugh was surprisingly genuine. "I begin to understand why Diego was so concerned about rumors of your survival." A pause, then. "The woman's aim is impressive. Military training?" "Federal agent," Sarah replied cheerfully, her rifle never wavering from her coverage of the yard. "Though I've had plenty of practice shooting rats off the property." John used their exchange to close the distance. Moving through shadows he knew better than his own reflection. El Coyote was good, but he was fighting on ground that had been designed specifically to channel and control movement. Every apparent piece of cover had been positioned to force predictable responses. "Your men are down," John said, now only 15 feet from the tracker's position. "You're alone in the dark on land you don't know. I'm offering you a chance to walk away." "Walk away." El Coyote's voice carried genuine amusement. "Into a federal prison, perhaps? I know how this game is played, Senor Malone. There is no walking away." The tracker moved like a striking snake, rolling around the barrels with his gun already firing. But John had spent 15 years practicing for moments just like this. His first shot knocked El Coyote's bullet off course. The second sent the gun spinning from his hand, and the third put a neat hole through the tracker's hat brim, a mirror of Sarah's earlier warning shot. El Coyote froze, finding himself staring down the barrels of both pearl-handled revolvers. John's voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "If I'd wanted you dead, you'd never have made it past the wash. This isn't about killing you, it's about sending a message. To Diego." El Coyote nodded slowly, professional respect evident in his tone. "But you don't know him like I do. He won't stop. He can't afford to, now that Jack Malone has returned." "Oh, we're counting on that," Sarah said, appearing at the barn door with her rifle trained steadily on the tracker. She'd moved positions without making a sound, another skill practiced over years of quiet preparation. "In fact, his reaction to your report is a key part of our plan." John kept his revolvers leveled as Sarah efficiently disarmed and bound the tracker. "Your reputation for intelligence was well earned," he told El Coyote. "So I trust you'll understand exactly what it means that we're letting you live to carry this message back." El Coyote's eyes widened slightly as the implications sank in. You want him to come himself. All of this, the nephews, the ambush, letting me see your capabilities. It's bait. Like the lady said, John replied, holstering his revolvers. With practice, Grace, every piece of ground, every shadow, every move has been 15 years in preparation. The only question is, will Diego be smart enough to see the trap, or angry enough to walk into it anyway? Sarah finished securing their prisoner and stood, brushing dust from her skirts with the same precise movements she used during peaceful days. Either way, she said calmly, Black Jack Malone will be waiting. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as Tom Henderson's deputies loaded El Coyote's wounded men into a prison wagon. The tracker himself sat calmly in the yard, watching John with thoughtful eyes as Sarah tended to his men's injuries, with business-like efficiency. You know, El Coyote said finally, I spent 3 years tracking down the truth about Black Jack Malone's disappearance. Diego was obsessed with the legend, the outlaw who never killed without reason, never stole, and from the poor never failed to hit his target. He smiled slightly. But the real story is even better than the legend, isn't it? The fierce gunslinger who found redemption in love, only to become something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to prove and everything to protect. John leaned against the porch railing, his pearl-handled revolvers catching the early light. You'll tell Diego what you saw here? Every detail, El Coyote confirmed. The ranch that's really a fortress. The retired outlaw who's sharper than ever. The federal agent wife who shoots like an angel of death. He shook his head in admiration. It won't stop him, you know. In fact, it will make him come faster. We're counting on it, Sarah said, finishing a bandage on his second man's hand. Diego Martinez needs to learn what every corrupt baron and crooked official learned 15 years ago. Some legends are more than just stories. Tom Henderson rode up as the prison wagon was pulling out, his expression grave. Just got word. From the telegraph office, Diego Martinez crossed the border last night with 20 riders. He's coming himself, sooner than we expected. John mused, but his voice carried no concern. How long? 2 days, maybe 3. He's not trying to hide his movement. Tom dismounted, handing Sarah a sealed envelope. This just came through Martha's network. Federal Marshal's office has approved the operation. You've got full authority to proceed. El Coyote's eyebrows rose. The famous Black Jack Malone, working with federal authority. The world has indeed changed. Not as much as you might think, John replied, watching Sarah read through the official documents. Still fighting the same fight, just with better allies this time. Sarah folded the papers carefully. Diego's made too many mistakes, moving from legitimate business into open violence, sending his nephews to do his dirty work, now crossing the border with armed men. She smiled grimly. He's given us everything we need to take him down legally. Unless, of course, he resists. Arrest, Tom added meaningfully. Then it becomes a matter of defending the peace of our territory. El Coyote laughed softly. Now I understand. You're not just laying a trap, you're creating a choice. Face justice or die resisting it, but either way, he nodded respectfully to John. Black Jack Malone gets to finish what he started 15 years ago, cleaning up the territory once and for all. Mount up, Tom ordered his deputies. Get him back to town with the others. I want the jail fully secured before word spreads about Diego's approach. As the lawmen rode out with their prisoner, John turned to Sarah. You knew, didn't you? All those years ago in Del Rio, you knew exactly who I was and what I could become. She touched his cheek gently. I knew who you were the moment you walked into my bank. Not the legend, not the outlaw, but the man beneath it all. Someone who couldn't stand by while others suffered, who used his skills to fight injustice in the only way he knew how. Her smile carried 15 years of shared secrets. I just helped give that fight a legal framework. John pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair mixed with gun smoke. And now, are you ready to face what's coming? I've been ready for 15 years, she replied firmly. Every practice session, every preparation, every moment we've built this life together. It was all leading to this. Diego Martinez isn't just another corrupt baron. He's everything we fought against back then, everything we've been preparing to face again. From the house, they could hear Martha Henderson's distinctive knock. More intelligence would be arriving. Through the quilting network, more pieces falling into place for the coming confrontation. 2 days, John mused, looking out over the ranch they'd turned into a fortress. Time enough to remind everyone why Black Jack Malone's name used to make men tremble. Sarah checked her rifle with practiced hands. And time enough to show them something new, what happens when legend and law work together. She met his eyes with quiet certainty. Diego won't know what hit him. No, John agreed, feeling the familiar clarity of purpose settling over him. But he's about to learn what every other corrupt man who's threatened this territory learned. Some legends don't just die, they evolve, Sarah finished, her hand finding his. They become something stronger. A month after Diego Martinez's last ride, John stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar golds and reds. The bullet holes in the barn had been patched, the fence posts replaced, and the land was healing itself as it always did. Sarah's flowers were blooming again, their gentle colors belying the fierce firefight that had raged around them. The newspapers had told the story their way, how the notorious Diego Martinez had met his end facing down a joint force of federal marshals and local lawmen. They spoke of justice served, of law and order triumphing over corruption and violence. What they didn't mention was the quiet rancher and his wife who had orchestrated it all, or how Black Jack Malone's legend had played its final, perfect role. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sarah asked, stepping out to join him. She carried 2 cups of coffee, a peaceful echo of countless evenings they'd shared on this porch. "Just thinking about Diego's face," John replied, accepting his cup. The moment he realized he hadn't just walked into a trap, he'd walked into history repeating itself. Sarah smiled, leaning against him. The corrupt baron falling to the same combination of legend and law that had cleaned up the territory 15 years ago. There's poetry in that. The last of Diego's empire was being dismantled through legal channels now. Martha Henderson's quilting circle had provided enough evidence to keep federal prosecutors busy for years. The territory would be cleaner for it, safer for honest folks trying to build their lives. "Tom says the stories are already spreading," Sarah continued, "about how Black Jack Malone came back one last time working alongside the law he once fled. They're calling it the end of an era, and the beginning of a new one," John added, thinking of young Tommy Henderson and others like him who would grow up in a territory where justice wore a badge instead of a black duster coat. A rider appeared on the horizon. Just the evening mail carrier this time. No more gunmen testing their defenses. No more outlaws seeking to make a name for themselves. The legend of Black Jack Malone had served its purpose and could rest now, transformed into something that strengthened the law instead of standing outside it. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked softly. John looked at his wife, his partner in every sense of the word, and thought about the life they'd built together. 15 years of peace hadn't been a retirement after all, but a preparation for one last, vital mission, and they'd faced it together, each bringing their own strengths to create something greater than either legend or law alone could achieve. "Not a single one," he replied, pulling her close as the sun sank behind their land. Their home, their legacy. They say if you pass by the Harrison Ranch on a quiet evening, you might see an aging couple on their porch, her head on his shoulder, his pearl-handled revolvers at rest. Not an outlaw and an agent, not legend and law, but something rarer, partners who found their truth in the space between justice and redemption.